So thank you, Sheryl, for joining me on this video call. I've been looking forward to interview you because I've been following your stuff online more recently, and your new book out, The Wisdom of Anxiety, is a great resource for people. So thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me here, Barry. It's really a pleasure to connect with you.
And you have this interesting background of having experienced anxiety yourself, which I think makes a huge difference when you're helping other people, because I know you have a successful psychotherapy practice and you obviously meet a lot of people who suffer from anxiety, but having had that personal experience, I'd say makes a big difference for your clients.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think when somebody knows that you know what they're going through, it already creates this just an intrinsic level of safety of like, you get it, because anxiety can be such an isolating experience and you can so easily feel like I'm the only one, even though we know that millions and millions and if not billions of people are struggling with anxiety. People don't talk about it. They don't talk about it at dinner parties. They don't talk about it really with anybody. And so to have a therapist who knows what you are going through, it makes a big difference.
Yeah, big time. There's that saying, you can only bring people as far as you've been yourself. And I think with mental health, it's very true.
Absolutely. And with therapy in general, whether we're talking about anxiety or depression or whatever the issue is, or being able to handle your emotional realm, it's knowing that your therapist is not going to be afraid by anything you bring them, any thought, any intrusive thought, any experience, right? I've been there and I've heard thousands of stories. And so there's already just that leveling of the playing field.
Yeah. I want to take you back to a trip to Brazil that you took in your early 20s, I think. And that was almost like your initiation into anxiety and panic disorder. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and maybe the you before that trip and then the you after that trip?
Yes. So I was 20 when I went to Brazil. So that was 28 years ago. And the me before that trip was the me that did everything right. I was the straight A student. I fit the mold, I played the game, and I thought that my life was pretty darn great, and really did not relate to people who struggled with anxiety or depression. And so, like I talk about in The Wisdom of Anxiety, there was a bit of a glass castle mindset of, I'm up, even though I never would have said that out loud, but it was like, my life's just going along smoothly. And then I went to Brazil and it broke me open. It was my broken open experience. It was truly an initiation. I was in hell from the minute I got there. And it was really my own personal hell. It was not Brazil's fault. But it was my own hell that I had squashed for so many years that was then being projected onto the screen of that experience.
But why exactly? Like, what was it about Brazil that triggered something, or
I was raised on the west side of Los Angeles in a very, very safe, very I mean, there is diversity, but it was pretty homogenous in the scale of things. And I had never experienced that level of poverty. I mean, I was in a part of Brazil that was quite poor. I had never experienced that level of, I would wake up in the middle of the night and there would be cockroaches lining the floor to the point where the floor was black and it was formerly a white floor. So it was, and they were this big. Yeah. And, this was so outside my comfort zone. Mm-hmm. And it was that every day for 4 months. It was violence. It was, I saw somebody get shot in Carnival in the streets. There was regularly pools of blood on the street. And it was not anything remotely close to what I had been used to. And there was also so much beauty and so much soul and so much richness, but I couldn't really see that because I was in trauma. And what Brazil did, those external experiences, it really brought my own internal trauma that had been under the surface to light. I also had an experience in Brazil of my first, actually it was my first panic attack. In the book, I say my first panic attack was driving down the freeway. But this one, I tend to forget about it, which is interesting. But I was swimming in the ocean, and a riptide undercurrent came, and I couldn't get back. And it was instant panic of, I'm going to die. And luckily there were lifeguards on the shore. It was the one and only time my entire stay in Brazil that there were lifeguards. So I definitely felt like something was watching over me, but also probably because there was the riptide and undercurrent there. And they came out and they got me. And then I just sort of pushed that experience aside, didn't think of it. So when I came home from Brazil after those 4 months, I was in shock. I was in trauma. I did not want to leave the house. I definitely had some agoraphobia. It was an overload for my nervous system. That was in May of that year. And it was 1992, maybe. It wasn't until the following February that I had the experience that I share in the book of driving down the freeway and talking about a dream that I had, about Brazil.
Gotcha.
And so there's the unconscious coming in. And Friday night in Los Angeles, bumper to bumper traffic, lights everywhere. And it was, again, system overload with that unconscious material coming up about the dream.
Yeah.
And suddenly everything was, it was depersonalization, was that first moment of like nothing was real. And then from there it was instant panic, my heart, my chest. I pulled over. I had the classic experience of I must be dying. I must be having a heart attack. Called 911, went to the emergency room. They said, you're fine, but they didn't say you just had a panic attack, which would have been really helpful. And it still was a long time before I even understood what had happened, that it was a panic attack.
How long was it?
So that was February. When I tried to drive back to school that next day, I couldn't do it. And so then ensued a driving phobia. But I white knuckled. I had to get back to school. I white knuckled my way through that drive. And it was probably another 2 months before I started to put the pieces together of, oh, that was a panic attack. And there wasn't the information back then that there is now. There was no internet. So it was hard to put pieces together. I don't even know really how I did, but I started seeing a therapist. I had been in therapy anyway, but it wasn't until the panic that, like I said, like my whole unconscious, my whole underworld was unleashed. But it was still many, 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 many years before I understood what the messages were. I started graduate school a couple years after that, shortly after I graduated, maybe 2 years after, and it was in a Jungian program. So that gave me some pieces of recognizing that this wasn't random, this wasn't the universe torturing me, I wasn't being singled out, that this was my unconscious pulling me in, initiating me for the purpose of growth and of healing.
And then, okay, you had your therapeutic practice, and I understand you were doing a lot of work with couples and relationships, because you had a few Oprah experiences where you were talking about couples and marriage issues. And then, but why did you write the book on anxiety only a year or two ago? Was it a year out, maybe?
Not even a year. Yeah, it came out last May 2019. That's a great question. So my initial work was really around transitions. Those Oprah appearances were on the wedding transition of what happens in, again, the underbelly, I'm always interested in what's not being talked about in the mainstream, right? What gets pushed down? What is shadow? So that first book was The Conscious Bride. It came out of my master's thesis on the underbelly of the wedding transition, the grief and the fear and the uncertainty and the doubt that happens during all transitions. But because around the wedding, it's touted as the pinnacle of joy, especially for a woman, all of those painful feelings get squashed, and then they often morph into anxiety. So anxiety was there, but it wasn't the focus of my work. That then sort of channeled into relationship anxiety, not so much working with couples, but with somebody's own anxiety about a very loving relationship, their own doubt that again gets projected onto the partner. So that was the anxiety piece around couples, around relationships.
And probably some element of intrusive thoughts, like, do I really love this person? That kind of stuff.
Massive intrusive thoughts around relationship. It's what the culture calls ROCD, but I'm not a big fan of any diagnoses, so I don't like that term, but it fits for some people. They like it, but I call it relationship anxiety. But it's that obsessive wheel in the rumination of your mind. Do I love this person enough? Am I attracted enough? It's hyper focusing on one issue and perseverating over and over and over and over again. So that really was the roots of my initiation into working with intrusive thoughts directly. And then from there, it became really clear that my audience was a highly sensitive population. And I talk about in the Wisdom of Anxiety in my work, this sort of anxious, sensitive, creative spectrum of personality type. So if we only focus on the anxiety, we tend to then focus on the diagnosis and the pathology of I'm this anxious person. We forget that anxiety so often starts with sensitivity, right? Yeah. And it can be channeled into creativity. And in the middle, we get the anxiety. So when you have a highly sensitive child, as I have two of, and that sensitivity is deeply honored and respected, and there are boundaries in place to protect that child from the onslaught of information, especially in today's world, and to protect their highly, highly sensitive heart, yes, the anxiety will still come out, but it can be worked with. And then that is tended to. And then eventually it can then channel into creativity and innovation and really why we're here. Because we're not here to sit here being anxious people, right? Who can't leave our house and can't be in relationships and worry about our health and the state of the world. And that's not our function for being here. But when we don't have a way to work with the anxiety effectively, it definitely gets stuck there. So the combination of working with this highly sensitive population through the portal of relationship anxiety, seeing that the issue wasn't ever the relationship, it was their own, because one of the first questions I always ask my clients is this the first time you've had anxiety in the relationship? And the answer is 100% always no. I've been anxious my whole life. Right? Yeah. So it's just manifesting in these different, I call it, where is your anxiety hanging its hat? What's the current hook, right? So it can be really, as you know, it can be relationship, it can be health, it can be the world, it can be sexuality, it can be anything, but it tends to constellate around these certain themes. So the combination of having this population of highly sensitive people and raising my two sons at the same time was really what started to hone my work and clarify that my work is actually about anxiety, which is why it took me all that time to write the second book. It was actually my third book, was The Wisdom of Anxiety. It was those 10 years of writing the blog weekly, working with that population and raising my kids.
And do you think most people or the majority of people who suffer from anxiety do have that personality type, that highly sensitive personality type?
I do. I do. That's not based on any kind of formal research. Very much anecdotal, just from my own experience. I have rarely encountered somebody, I wouldn't say never.
I was just asking you, we were talking about personality types and the sensitivity, and you were saying that you rarely ever meet somebody who doesn't have that level of sensitivity going on.
It's extremely rare. I would say occasionally it does happen. Somebody will say, I really don't identify as a highly sensitive, but even those people, if we chart back into their childhood, it's often because they adapted to their family culture, which had an expectation of being more extroverted. Now, and you can be highly sensitive and extroverted, but they shut down their sensitivity so early on. This term highly sensitive, which I love so much, and I'm so grateful to Elaine Aron for bringing it to consciousness. It's an amazing term, but I also truly believe that all humans and all babies and all children are deeply sensitive at the core. We all feel so deeply. And And yes, there is a subsection. There is a true temperamental trait of high sensitivity that shows up in 20% of all species across all animal kingdoms. So that is its own trait. But we are all sensitive, and it doesn't take much to shut down that sensitivity growing up. It takes, one moment of being made fun of, teased, bullied, which almost every child sadly experiences, whether it's in their family culture or at school or in religion or wherever it is. So yes, I do find that people who find their way to me are in fact highly sensitive. But when I wrote The Wisdom of Anxiety, my editor said, I don't want you to focus too much on this term high sensitivity, because what you're talking about really applies to everybody. And we don't want people to read it and say, well, I'm not a highly sensitive person, so this doesn't apply.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I'm really curious as well about the Jungian approach towards anxiety and how anxiety is viewed through that lens. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Yes. So the Jungian approach understands all of our symptoms, whether it's anxiety, depression, rumination, intrusive thoughts, somatic symptoms, as manifestations, as communications from the unconscious. So we're not devising and creating these symptoms. They're coming from the unconscious layer that is infinitely wiser than we are. And they're coming to let us know that something is awry, that something needs attention. So anxiety comes up, or an intrusive thought comes up. Our first inclination, and it's cultural and biological habit, is to push away from pain, right? You talk so much about this in your book. Like this is what we are designed to do. Push away, get away, too hard, too painful. But the Jungian approach is so beautiful in that it really does invite us to welcome it in with the recognition that it is here to teach us, it is here to guide us, it is here to inform us that we are ready to grow, we are ready to heal. So, for example, with health anxiety, let's take health anxiety as an example. So common. You have a symptom. It feels so real, and it probably is real because, also when you're highly sensitive, you are highly sensitized to every nuance in your body, every lump, every bump, every bruise, every single thing that goes on in your body. You are on high alert, okay? Because that's also part of the profile, is to be on high alert, is to be hypervigilant. It served us so well when we lived out, in the outback, in the jungle, to be on high alert. We were the hypervigilant scouts, keeping everybody safe. So all of that energy is now turned inward. My body is now the landscape. My body is now, the plains that I'm trying to make sure nothing bad happens. So I'm highly, highly sensitized to anything that's different. So I notice something new. My anxious mind wants to kick up and say, I have cancer. I know this is it. I have cancer. From a Jungian perspective, you would say, that's an intrusive thought, or that's anxiety. Let's name it first for what it is. Let's recognize that there's information coming through. And then let's name it as a metaphor. And this is the other brilliance of Jungian psychology, is the recognition that the unconscious speaks in the language of metaphors and symbols, like our dream life, right? So that's our most accessible and relatable experience of the unconscious, is that we all dream, and we all know how weird dreams are because they're not speaking regular language. They're speaking the language of metaphor. So our bodies and our thoughts speak that same language. They're coming from the same place. So let's say the symptom is I suddenly have this new rash, and my mind wants to catastrophize, my anxious mind. But my wise mind will say, from the language of metaphor, have I acted rashly, right? So unconscious uses play on words a lot, just like when we do dream work. It's going into the play on words, into the double meaning. Or if I'm struggling with a heart, palpitation, such a common symptom of anxiety, is to ask, where am I out of rhythm, right? Or what am I not grieving in my heart? It's in my heart. So this is emotion. Where is there pain, right? And so it's taking the symptom and not taking it at face value. That's the key. Not taking it literally. and going deep and asking, what is the message? What is the metaphor? What is needed?
And is there a shift when there's a recognition of what the message is?
There is quite often a palpable shift. So when I do this work with a client and we'll go over the possibility of metaphors and I'll land on one and you can see it's an aha moment of, wow, yes. And then there's something to work with. So instead of focusing here on the symptom and driving yourself into anxious rabbit hole hell, you can now focus here on, and this is a much more interesting place to focus. And it's not formulaic. It's not like ding, 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 you got it right, and then your symptom goes away and all is well. That's again, the Western linear mindset of, I can figure this out and I can crack the code and I can get rid of it. That's not the intention. The intention is to explore it and to be curious. And now I can journal with this piece of, what am I grieving, right? Or, let's go back to the cancer example of, the metaphor for cancer is so often, what is eating away at me? Because cancer is this thing that eats. What is eating away? What am I not speaking? What am I not expressing? Where am I not showing my true self or using my voice? And this is, again, much more fruitful to explore here than to stay stuck here. Now, easier said than done, because health anxiety, I've been there a few times in my life, and it is hell because it feels so real and the stakes are so high, and your mind goes to, but what if it is, what if it is cancer? What if it is real? Sure. And it can be so hard to crack that code and to make that shift. It's like pulling against gravity to say, I'm going to assume that it's not, because I just had my annual physical, like, let's just get that piece out of the way. Mm-hmm. I just got a clean bill of health. I know I'm healthy. Let me trust. And there's actually so many layers to health anxiety. There is a piece of being able to trust authority and trust doctors. And then we talked a little bit about that, of like, the longing for the family doctor that would just say, you're good, right? But now you go to the doctor and they're like, well, actually it could be, because it's all litigious and they have to cover their asses and they have to give you this test. And so that can often inflame health anxiety. You go to doctor after doctor after doctor. So that's its own realm of addressing the doctor piece. But let's say you can trust enough to say, I just got a clean bill of health. Now I'm going to pull all of that energy off of that incredibly compelling addictive thought. And I do talk about intrusive thoughts like mental addictions, because they absolutely can take over your mind. And that's another way to work with them also that I'd like to touch on, is from the mental addiction piece. But if you can manage to do that and move it over here into the metaphor and the curiosity, right, and the exploration, you're going to break free from that hold, right? And you're going to come back to more sanity inside.
So the search for the metaphor, it gives them a sense of meaning as well, doesn't it? Because they're trying to, well, they can attach meaning to the symptom.
Yes, and that's a great gift of Jungian psychology, is couching all of this in meaning. That it's not just random. And when we have a sense of meaning, it does give us an anchor point, and it does help us feel like we're not just randomly floating around in the universe and being attacked in these mean ways. It's like, no, this is all for a purpose. All of it's for a purpose. So, going back to that trip to Brazil, it was awful. Like, I'm not going to romanticize any of it. It was truly awful. And it is what birthed the next 28 years of my life's work, who I am as a human, the way I raise my children, the way I am as a wife. I mean, it changed everything. And these broken open experiences can change everything. So, I'll often hear, you probably hear this too, but with people suffering from anxiety, and I'll say to them right off the bat, I know it's hard to believe it now, but it is a gift. And they'll say, there's no way, this is torture, I'm in hell. And I say, I know, but it is a gift. And then they'll, 6 months later, they'll say, I get it. It is a gift. It's completely changed how I think about myself. It's given my life, some new direction. It creates more compassion. And that was probably the biggest piece of what that experience was for me, is it completely humbled me. I'm like, no, I'm just a completely fallible person with tons of issues that need attention, right? So yes,
And it's what you're doing in the book, isn't it? You're
yes.
normalizing anxiety and then showing the meaning or purpose behind the experience.
And the gift of it. So the first title I had for that book was The Gift of Anxiety, instead of The Wisdom of Anxiety. I love the title now, but because I really do see it as a gift when we approach it as an opportunity for learning and an opportunity for healing. And whether it's learning, how to work with our thoughts, whether it's learning how to meet our emotions, I talk about it in the 4 realms of self. How to work with fear. I mean, that's why I love your book so much, because it's such a tangible process that you offer for meeting fear and for becoming empowered as a human. So there's so much richness that, if you see fear as the enemy or anxiety as the enemy, you're in a constant state of battle, right? But if you recognize it as a friend, as an ally in disguise, just that alone changes everything.
Yeah, brilliant. I want to bring you back then to the point you said you wanted to make a point about the mental side of intrusive thoughts.
Yes. So we learn early in life, because of the pain that we experience, often highly sensitive children, but I think all beings have early pain, emotional pain, and caregivers don't know how to meet it because it hasn't been met in their own selves. So it's too big for a little body to handle by a child's own self. So they go up into the safety of the head, right? It's a much clearer space up there, and you can attach onto a question like, what if I die? It's a really common thought for young sensitive kids. Well, what if my parents die? It's often the first manifestation of anxiety or intrusive thoughts as around death. And it's so scary, but what it does is it brings you out of that very messy, amorphous space of emotions into your head. And so now you're spinning around up here, trying to answer this fundamentally unanswerable question, which is what intrusive thoughts are, sometimes for years, right? Up here. And then it changes. And then it's about my sexuality. What if I'm gay? What if I'm straight? Or whatever it is. And then it's and then it's health anxiety, and there's this typical trajectory, and then it's relationship anxiety, and that's often when people find me. But as long as you are up here in the headspace, you are not really going to heal at the deepest level, because the invitation is to recognize the intrusive thought. The cut-through question that I offer is, what is this thought protecting me from feeling? If I'm up here, I'm not going to feel here, just like any addiction, anything that temporarily quells us, temporarily fills us in, temporarily gives us that sense of control, makes us feel a little bit stronger, a little bit like we have the reins. So it's the same with intrusive thoughts. So when you
what do you find most people are not willing to feel?
Their grief, their pain, that's the biggest piece. Mm-hmm. But really the whole spectrum of human emotions: disappointment, boredom, jealousy, anger, raw fear, not anxiety attached fear, but just the raw fear, existential fear. But the biggest one is pain. It's grief. We've all had loss in our life. And the grief from that loss tends to get squashed down. But it's not always. So, I'm always thinking of like the person listening going, but I haven't had any major losses, so this must not apply to me. So first of all, just being human is a lot. Just being born is a loss, right? Just going from being in the perfect environment of the womb into like, it's cold, and and like, what just happened? And that's a trauma. We all have trauma, whether you want to admit it or not. We all have trauma, even if you were raised by completely loving parents, because that's something I get a lot. But my parents were so loving. Great. That's wonderful. There's intergenerational trauma. There's trauma that's passed down that has never been talked about. Like there's your grandfather that was in the Holocaust that no one ever mentioned, and that gets passed down. There's trauma in school. There's trauma around friends and peers. There's trauma around siblings. It's a big one that gets overlooked in therapeutic circles, I think, a lot, because we're so focused on parents, that we miss all of the other places where we feel not good enough, we feel inadequate, we feel shame. So the shame piece comes in pretty early of what's wrong with me, right?
Yeah.
That sense of not belonging, of I'm so different, especially when you're highly sensitive. So,
you know what I'm always curious about is how we've evolved to be, like the dominant species on the planet, and yet we're so sensitive and so easily traumatized. And like, why is it a part of us? We talk a lot about it now because, let's say in the last 30, 40 years, because we're interested in psychology. But this has been going on for hundreds of thousands of years, the ability to be so easily traumatized. And why do you think it's there? Why do you think we're so vulnerable and easily traumatized?
It's a great question. I mean, I don't know if I can answer why that's there. It's just the way we are as humans. But I think what we're seeing now in this age of what I see as a great transition that we're in, a great global transition, and this speaks to the eco-anxiety piece that comes up a lot these days, is that we are being invited / dragged. It's being demanded that we reestablish a relationship with that sensitivity and that vulnerability, because so much of our actions as humans comes from a complete annihilation of one's connection to one's heart. Like, we couldn't do what we've done as humans, which is like on the verge of destroying the planet, but I really think we're going to be okay. If we were connected to that vulnerability and that heart space. So it's a giant question. Like, people like Riane Eisler, who have been on the forefront of the sort of new feminist model for a long time, in terms of exploring what happened in the time of history when we went from matrilineal partnership cultures to domination, conquest, patriarchal cultures. And every time we annihilate our hearts, we are coming from that mindset of slashing through, dominating an emotional experience that is so core and intrinsic to who we are. We have to shift into that more feminine model, and that has nothing to do with gender. We have to shift into embracing our sensitivity and our vulnerability as humans if we're going to cross over into a different paradigm that is based in kindness and partnership. Right? It's all rooted in this sense of recognizing our vulnerability.
Yeah, makes sense. You do a great job of normalizing anxiety in your blog posts, in your book, or any of the videos I've seen of you. And you speak as well about disorders and that label of disorder that person often gets when they visit a mental health professional or their doctor. So somebody might be given the label of generalized anxiety disorder, and they might hold on to that label. And you think that can be quite destructive or problematic, at least?
I think it can be. I wouldn't say it always is. For some people, it's a comfort to know this is what it is. It's a thing, right? And it's not who I am. It's this other thing, and that can be comforting. I don't like the word disorder, because it sounds like there's something wrong. If it's in disorder, then it's not in order. And the way I talk about it is, no, everything is in perfect order. Your psyche, your internal systems are doing exactly what they are meant to do. It is a perfect communication system that's happening. There's nothing in disorder, and there's certainly nothing disordered about you. So for some people, it can be comforting. For a lot of people, it's not. And it's a label, and they become attached to that label of, I have OCD. I have, and it becomes, well, I am this disorder. And then it's limiting, because it doesn't acknowledge that, but you can grow through that. Like, these are all, again, it's one of the reasons I love your book so much. It's so empowering to know, yeah, I struggle with this, and I can move through it and be a stronger and more courageous person. And it doesn't have to define me, right? I mean, something like highly sensitive, that's a temperament trait. That's not something you get over, nor would I want anybody to, so I couch them and I package them all together because I want people to see that it exists on this beautiful continuum, again, of sensitive, anxious, creative, spiritual, right? This other side, that it's all, you are a package. You are this beautiful, exquisite, extraordinary package. When you meet your anxiety with compassion and curiosity, you access your sensitivity and you access your creativity. And again, I feel so passionate about it because our world so desperately needs the sensitive people to work through the limiting beliefs, work through those bars of the cage and break them open so that they can offer who they are, right? I often talk about the example of my older son, who's now 15 and a half. And I don't think there was a more sensitive person on the planet than that child. I mean, everything. He just, it was an exquisite sensitivity. There's an amazing Pearl S. Buck quote about sensitivity. And when I found that, I was like, oh my God, this is our child. And I did not know how he was going to function in this world, whether it was sights, sounds, foods, people, like the sensory and nervous system overload was intense around sleep, around, it was everywhere. And we just tended and tended and tended, honored, never shamed him, never labeled him, never got him diagnosed, because to us, it wasn't a problem, right? It was challenging. It's not easy raising a highly sensitive child. It's a lot easier in some ways to raise a typical child. But we also always saw like the brilliance of his mind was off the charts, always from day one almost. His creativity, his storytelling, like it was just like this incredible package of a human being. And we got a lot of heat from family. You're coddling him, you're overprotecting, you're this, you're that. And we're like, okay, well, this is what we're doing. He always had a passion for flight. And his passion and us honoring the passion is, I think, one of the things that got him through, because it was such a motivator to learn how to regulate and learn how to tolerate this world. So when he was 14, he soloed in a glider out of Boulder Airport. And it was on so many levels just this extraordinary celebration, that this child who literally would not leave our house when we moved from Los Angeles to Denver for 2 months. He would not leave the house. Any person who came to the door, he would scream. And he was so overloaded by that transition. I talk a lot about transitions as well, and how they there are times when often the anxiety comes out during transitions, such vulnerable times for us as humans. But this child who at 2 years old had that experience now literally dreams of going to Mars.
Wow. And it's such a brave thing to do, to fly like that.
Such a brave thing to do. I mean, so brave. And that's not one of the places where he's had fear. So it wasn't that he had to overcome that fear, but he had to, regulate himself as a human, right? To be able to tolerate everything that flight involves. Right? So if he can do it, there's like any person on the planet can take that core of sensitivity, right, and nurture it and tend to it and attend to the anxiety that comes from it until it channels along into the gift.
And you say these people are very important for the future, so that they're out there, they're outspoken, they show up.
Yes, like look at this Greta Thunberg, who's like going to save the planet. I mean, she's just out there doing her thing. She's obviously feeling so deeply, right? And I mean, she tells her diagnosis that she's on the spectrum, and I don't care about that, but she wants to talk about that, that's fine. But she's differently wired is the point. Like her brain is wired differently. And so are highly sensitive people, and so are anxious. We have a different wiring. And it's such an important wiring that we not pathologize, that we not diagnose, that I mean, medication is its own big conversation, but, you know, quite often people get over medicated and then they lose touch with that heart, that sensitive heart. You know, sometimes medication is what allows them to continue to function and do the inner work. So I hold both places around it. But yes, we need these people. We absolutely need the sensitives of the world to embrace who they are and bring their gifts. And it doesn't have to be in a Greta Thunberg way. Like, it can be with your kids, with your family, with your garden, with your cat. Like, you know, it doesn't have to be this big public way, but it's being fully who you are, right, will naturally touch whoever is in your life.
I know you're not worried about the future, the ecology of the planet.
Well, I would say I'm not worried. I definitely am worried. Yes.
So there's this thing going on, it seems, where anxiety is ramping up for lots of different reasons, whether it is worry about climate change or technology or the new pressures that kids are under. What do you think, how do you think this plays out for the next 10, 20 years? How are these people best helped?
So, you know, again, by meeting their anxiety with as much compassion and curiosity as they can, so that they learn to work with their thoughts. I'm creating a course right now on eco-anxiety because it's so big and it can be so paralyzing. And I want to give people a different framework to work with. It's the same framework that I work with any form of anxiety, of working with all four realms of self: physical, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual. And recognizing that whatever the doorway is into anxiety, we have this opportunity to ask what is needed, right? What is being activated? What is being projected onto the world screen, right? You know, I worked with a client who was struggling, several clients actually, who were struggling with climate anxiety and worry for Mother Earth, and recognizing how much of that was a projection of their own mother wound, right? Their own personal mother. And that when they were able to attend to that grief, right, it then freed up energy to attend and take action. It's not that there are not very real problems happening. And that's the thing with anxiety. There's always truth, some grain of truth to it. And with climate anxiety, there's a big grain. It's much more than a grain. Like, there is really a problem happening, yes. But if we are mired in fear and paralysis, we're not doing any good for anybody, ourselves or the planet. And so it's bringing a different mindset that helps us to crack that open, that stranglehold that we can get in anxiety, being curious about it, giving a different mind frame. For me, the framework of transitions is so helpful around climate change, because transitions tell us that there's always three phases. There's a death, a letting go, a crumbling. There's an in-between, which is a liminal zone. And then there's a new birth. So there's autumn, there's winter, and there's always spring, right? There's always a new birth that comes after the crumbling. We are crumbling. We all feel it. We all see it. The paradigms are no longer working. The value system is no longer working. But if you look closely, and this is not what mainstream news is going to report because it's fueled by fear, there's all these seeds of consciousness, like extraordinary new births, new seedlings popping up around, you know, gender and equality and women and justice and race and the planet itself, and our awareness of our interconnectedness, our oneness, and our great privilege and honor and duty that we have as humans to take care of others and take care of the earth. And like the conversations that we're seeing now, we were not even seeing 10 years ago. You know, there is this massive explosion of consciousness, which is the light, which is the new birth. And yes, there is a crumbling that has to happen, because the way that we've been doing it for thousands of years is not working.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great interview, Sharon, and I love the depth as well that you bring to it with that Jungian perspective and metaphors. Where can people find out about your work? And I'm sure a lot of people would be interested in that eco course as well. Where would they go to find out about that?
So my website is conscious-transitions.com, aptly so. And my courses are listed at the top. That course is in the making at the moment, so it's not available yet. But I have like 10 or 12 courses on there, and all different ways that anxiety manifests. And also really working with it at the root. I have a course on self-trust. That's a big piece of anxiety. I have a course on open your heart. I have a course on relationship anxiety. So all kinds of courses there. My blog as well, I write, like I said, weekly. So that's free and public for everybody. Lots of free offerings on my site. And then, of course, my book is The Wisdom of Anxiety. And I'm on Instagram. I finally
You took the leap.
What's that?
You took the leap to social media.
I took the leap, yes, with some mixed feelings. But I'm at Wisdom of Anxiety on Instagram.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sheryl. And I really do recommend people watching go check out your book, which you can get on Amazon, I presume, and all those other places where you online stores. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
And you have an audiobook version of that as well. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Barry. You know I'm a huge fan of your work, so this is really an honor to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah.